أكثر الصحفيين الغربيين شهرة بالمنطقة واللي كان شاهد على العديد من الحروب خلال 30 سنة. روبرت فيسك الصحافي والكاتب البريطاني الشاهد على الدخول السوفيتي إلى أفغانستان بالثمانينات، والشاهد أيضاً على الحرب الإيرانية العراقية، والشاهد أيضاً على الحرب اللي جرت الحرب الخليج الأولى والحرب الخليج الثانية، وأيضاً الشاهد على الانتفاضة الفلسطينية، من دون ما ننسى أيضاً أنه هو شاهد على الحرب الأهلية اللبنانية طوال فترتها ولا يزال ساكن بلبنان بصورة دائمة. روبرت، يعني بدي بلش أنه المقالات اللي بتكتبها بصحيفة الاندبندنت، الكتار بيقولوا أنه لما بيقروا كتابك أو لما بيقروا بعض الأشياء اللي بتكتبها على هامش هذه المقالات بيكون فيها متعة أكثر وبتكون شاهد أكثر على مشاهداتك وعلى الواقع اللي بتكون عم تنقله. هل لأنك بتاخد مواقف سياسية متطرفة بلحظتها؟
I would say that a lot of people would disagree with what I write. At least I hope some of them do. You know, I think that a lot of words have been used up describing what the job of a journalist should be. And they say we must be unbiased, unprejudiced, give 50% of each story to each side. I think we should be unbiased and unprejudiced on the side of those people who suffer injustice, the people who are occupied, the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who are dying, either at each other's hands or at American hands and sometimes at British hands in Iraq, the Afghans who die, as well as the occupation troops. And I think that the days when we can just go out and say, well, the Palestinians say this, the Israelis say that, the Iranians say this, and somehow expect the reader or the viewer to just read this patina of objective reporting. I don't think it is objective to do that. I think it's highly misleading. On top of that, you know, many journalists are now using what I call fraudulent words. In America, for example, the Israeli wall that has been built in the West Bank is called a fence or a security barrier. The East Germans called the Berlin Wall a security barrier. Again, you'll find the New York Times often uses the word disputed for the West Bank rather than occupied. And it's done that ever since Colin Powell, when he was US Secretary of State, told US embassies in the region to call it disputed, not occupied. And I think this is a very lethal thing to do, because what we do is we say, well, it's only a dispute, it's just a fence, so why does a Palestinian child throw a stone? If you realize that his land is occupied and land is being taken from his family, it makes more sense. But by talking about disputes and fences, it means that the Palestinians must be somehow generically violent.
كيف تفهم تقلب مواقف الصحفيين ببداية الحرب على العراق مثلا، اللي كانوا حتى مرافقين للدبابات الأمريكية، هلأ بعد 5 سنين صاروا عم ينتقدوا هذه الحرب وعم يحكوا عن أنه فشل هذه الحرب ويمكن خطأ.
The Americans, ever since Vietnam, which they largely blame the press for losing, of course, they've tried to make sure that journalists who are with them are corralled among them, that they depend upon, the British are the same, they depend upon British troops or American troops for their food, their safety, their security, their communications. And usually when they find reporters are in the capital of the city that's being attacked, as I was in Baghdad, the Ministry of Defence did this in London. They wrote to all the editors telling them that their journalists were in great danger in Baghdad and they urgently advised them to leave. You see, they wanted to control the journalists who were with the troops and get rid of the journalists who were with Iraqis. And my editor, I'd actually discussed with him before the war what the ministry would say. I knew this would happen. And I actually wrote him a funny letter saying, I imagine this is what the letter will be like. And Simon, my editor, called me up in Baghdad and said, Robert, we've just got the letter from the ministry, and it's almost exactly the same as the letter that you made up for us. And he said, of course you're staying. I said, absolutely. And I watched many of my colleagues being taken out of Baghdad by the editors, because the editors were obeying what the ministry said. So they had reporters only with the Americans and the British, and none with the Iraqis. We had people on both sides. We also had reporters who were with the Americans and the British, and we had me in Baghdad. I think that, you know, I will never be embedded, as they say. I don't want to work with armies. I've often talked to them in the field. I mean, I was talking to Iraqi soldiers, and later I was talking to American soldiers. But I wasn't protected by them. I was on my own. And, of course, that is a liability as well. But now, yes, of course, you see a lot of the reporters who supported the war, or newspapers did, are now either silent in shame that they did so, or they are proclaiming not that they were wrong, but that it went fine until Iraq was occupied, and then the Americans did no planning. In other words, it was a conceptual problem, not a problem of war. And my newspaper was totally against the war from the beginning in Iraq. We actually published in The Independent a route map for the people going on this 1 million strong march against the war. We supported those who were against the war in Iraq. I got to Kuwait City, and we were not all killed, which the Americans thought we would be, but it was a big gamble. They don't actually come along to listen to me because it's Robert Fisk at all. They come because they know they're being lied to in America particularly, and they want to hear what they suspect is really happening. The most appalling pictures of suffering in Basra, children who had lost limbs under British artillery fire, women who were screaming in pain. And of course, by not showing these terrible scenes which we see, we make war out to be somehow unbloody, cleaner than it is. Cleaner than it is.
هل في يعني مجموعة من الصحفيين مثلك مثل تشومسكي مثل نورمان فينكنشتاين حتى بمكان ما ألان جراش اللي هن مع إلى جانب القضية الفلسطينية وإلى جانب القضايا العربية والإسلامية تتصنفوا بهالخانة، بس هل أنتم بمحل ما مختلفين فقط عندكم صوت عالي فقط يعني ما في إمكانية عندكم لتغيروا؟
Well, there's two answers to that. First of all, I'm not into causes. You know, I feel immense sympathy for Palestinian people because they live in their refugee camps in hovels and filth, or they live in Palestine, which I put in quotation marks, and for most part either shot at or occupied. And I think that their situation is desperate and terrible. Their children grow up in this terrible circumstances. No people deserve to be put through what they've been put through. I suspect that people like Yasser Arafat have some of the blame for their situation. I didn't like Arafat very much, although I interviewed him many times. But I think that that does not make you pro-Palestinian. Any group of people in the world who've suffered injustice, it doesn't make you pro-Native American because of what the American Indians suffered at the hands of the American white men when America was founded, or after independence. You know, I think that when I covered the suicide bombing of a restaurant in Jerusalem in 2001, I was very close. A Palestinian blew himself up and made a restaurant, most of whom were children. And I wrote as movingly and as I could about the dead, who were Israelis, of course, and very savagely about the act of executing them, which is what the suicide bomb was doing. Equally, I was in Sabra Shatila, physically climbing over the corpses of dead, innocent Palestinians. And I did not give equal time to what the Israelis had to say. It was the survivors and the victims I wrote about, because they'd suffered this outrageous war crime.
هل فهم الشعب الأمريكي طبيعة الأزمة وحقيقة الصراع؟
I think many of them do, yes. American people are very smart. Of course, it's easy to be fooled by television reports, by claims that Saddam has weapons of mass destruction, etc., etc. A lot of British people were fooled. But there's no doubt, for example, that the audiences...
بس هل فهموا صار عندهم جواب على السؤال اللي انطرح لماذا يكرهوننا واللي أنت يمكن جاوبت عليه بعدد كبير من المقالات؟
Yes. You see, in America, it was Edward Said who said that the last taboo subject in America, you could talk about homosexuality, gays, you could talk about lesbianism, you could talk about black people, but you couldn't talk about America's relationship with Israel. That was taboo. And after 9/11, I used to bring this up, the relationship with Israel and America's policies in the Middle East. And I had people like Alan Dershowitz at Harvard screaming abuse over the air, over radio, at me, saying that to ask the question why ليش? Why did it happen? Was to be pro-terrorist and anti-American, and that was the same as being anti-Semitic. That's what he said to me. In the end, the studio pulled the plug on him because he was just being so abusive. But you see, when you have a country like America where people are encouraged not to discuss certain subjects, like the relationship between America and Israel and America's policies in the Middle East, there's a sort of closing down of conversation about it. What I try to do is talk directly about these matters and about America's folly in the Middle East. I mean, there's plenty of folly from the Islamic countries, but it is the world's largest superpower. So what I try to do is say to Americans, look, you can talk about it. Talk about it. The sky will not fall on you. You will not die if you speak about these subjects. And I don't know if it does any good. You know, I was cross-questioning myself on my balcony here at home in Beirut the other day whether anything I've written makes any changes, which is what you asked before, and I don't know if it does.
ما عم يتغير هالفكرة بعد يعني صدر كتاب مؤخرا عن اللوبي الإسرائيلي، عم بتحس إنه في تغيير بالموقف؟
Well, there's supposed to be a new lobby, isn't there, which is trying to counter the Israeli lobby. I mean, a Jewish lobby in America which doesn't agree with AIPAC and the big Jewish American lobby groups. Look, if I look at the United States now and then look at what it was like when I started giving regular lectures there 7 or 8 years ago, I've seen a change in Jewish Americans, certainly, particularly outside New York and Washington, where the big lobby groups are, in which younger generation of Jewish Americans realize something is very wrong and do not support Israel, right or wrong. Now, there are shades of, you know, different colors in this. It's not just, you know, one group is criticizing Israel and the other is not. But there's certainly much more discussion going on. And I think it's not people like me that influence them. I think it's people like the great Israeli journalist Amira Haas, who writes movingly about the Palestinians in Haaretz newspaper. And not only that, does so with more courage than American journalists will report on the Palestinians, because they're so frightened of being accused of being anti-Israeli that they won't, in my view, do their job properly. I think it's a, you know, I think that there is a change, but I don't see it with sort of rosy optimism. I don't think it's going to alter American policy. I don't think it's going to make the slightest difference whether McCain or Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama become the president. It'll be the same old policy. They'll just try and find another way of getting out of Iraq, which they will do. We now have 22 times as many Western military in the Islamic world than the Crusaders had in the 12th century.
عودة لمتابعة برنامج ترانزيت مع روبرت فيسك. روبرت، من على شرفتك ببيروت المطلة على البحر، شو عم تشوف للبنان اليوم؟
Well, mostly the Mediterranean and very noisy traffic jams. On my balcony in Beirut, I sit each morning having breakfast and thinking to myself, where is the explosion coming today? Because that is how dangerous the Middle East has become. If you mean what do I see of Lebanon?
بعد بتتوقع انه يصير في انفجارات. الفلسطينيين اليوم في غزة وفي رام الله، العراق كمان في عدة عراق، يعني في عراق الشيعي، عراق السني، عراق الكردي، كل الدول، لبنان اللي منقسم بين معارضة وموالاة، يعني بغض النظر عن الاختلافات، ولكن هذا التمزق الداخلي، يعني وين الانتصار؟
Yes. Well, the contradictions are partly helped by us, because we're always publishing maps, aren't we? Remember how we always publish maps of Iraq in our Western newspapers? Shiites at the bottom, of course, Sunnis in the middle, Kurdish at the top. The same with Lebanon, Shiites at the bottom again, you know, Sunnis in Sidon, Christians in Batroun and Juni and East Beirut, them Sunnis in Tripoli. And we used to do the same in Northern Ireland, in Belfast. We had areas which were coloured green for Catholic and orange for Protestants. In these societies where we're fighting, we're always emphasising the differences. But we don't, for example, concentrate on the differences in our wonderful societies. For example, I could publish you a map of Birmingham in England, showing its ethnic differences, Muslim, non-Muslim, for example, but no newspaper would publish it. I could do the same in Toronto. There's an area called Mississauga, a suburb west of Toronto, that is a majority Muslim. Would I ever see a map with it coloured green? No, because in our societies, we don't emphasise these divisions. But we like you to think about them. You know, one very easy answer to a question. I was giving a lecture in Nabatea last year for the Arabic edition of Great War for Civilization. And at the end, not all, there were some Christians there, but most, of course, of the people there were Shiite. A man asked me, Mr. Robert, as a foreigner, can you tell us what the future of Lebanon is? You see, and I said, look, you'll never have peace in Lebanon as long as you keep asking foreigners what the future of your country is. Go down to Jibshit and ask them. Go to Batroun and ask them. Go to the Be'ah. Go to East Beirut. Then you'll find out you can have peace if you do that, but stop asking foreigners. Stop listening to Tel Aviv or Tehran or London or Paris or Washington. And a lot of people clapped at this. They got the point. But of course, you still do go on listening to Washington and Tehran and Damascus and everybody else. But I don't know what you do, because you see in Lebanon you have this special tragedy. To be a modern state, you've got to get rid of confessionalism. But if you get rid of confessionalism, you're no longer Lebanon, because it's the identity of Lebanon. Its balance of sectarianism, if you like, is the way it works. You can't tear it to bits and start again. But I don't see how you can become a modern state with all the accoutrements of trust from the people to all the government, as long as you have a system so careful that it almost needs a PhD to understand your electoral system. I know some MPs who are still trying to learn about it in the Beirut Parliament when it sits. But, you know, again, you see, who created this particular country? The French did. And it was a French work of engineering, wasn't it? The ability and wish to use violence for political change has increased considerably on all sides. I don't think that violence does produce worthwhile political change. I believed from the start that Oslo was not going to work. You can't keep holding out to people apparent gifts and hopes, and then taking it all away, and then holding it out again. There's a lesson there somewhere, that somehow along the line, it's better to think of peace rather than another battle. There are people in Israeli society who believe that what Israel is doing is wrong.
اليوم صار في عنا قضايا بالشرق الأوسط، العراق، لبنان، أفغانستان، مجموعة قضايا. شو تغير؟
Well, I think there's no doubt that violence has changed. The ability and wish to use violence for political change has increased considerably on all sides. I mean, that applies to the Arabs, it applies to the Israelis, it applies to the Americans. And I don't think that violence does produce worthwhile political change of any kind at the end of the day. What's happened to the Palestinians is particularly painful, because I believed from the start that Oslo was not going to work. It sounded great, but it was supposed to be based on UN Security Council Resolution 242, which I think all your viewers will know too well without me repeating it. It turned out it was not based on that. It turned out that all the difficult issues, right of return, status of Jerusalem, etc., were to be left to the end. In other words, you were supposed to get married, Palestinians and Israelis, and later on find out if you were in love or not. You know, you can't work like that. It doesn't work. And there were no international guarantees attached to it. And sure enough, what happened? The moment the Palestinians realized that the pressures were on them to make concession after concession, they would turn to the Americans and say, help us. And the Americans would say, all we can do is bring the parties together. It is the parties themselves, Israel and Palestinians, who have to work out. And of course, since the Israelis are powerful and the Palestinians are not powerful, it was not going to work. But you see, what happened there is that at the time of Oslo, there was a general understanding that there would be an Israeli state and a Palestinian state. And many Palestinians, I know, particularly in Gaza, were prepared to accept that their original homes, because the Gaza Palestinians are mostly from that part of Palestine that became Israel 60 years ago, they were prepared to accept that they had lost Haifa and the other Arab cities as they were on the coast of Israel.
ولكن بالجانب الآخر الإسرائيليين هل هن محضرين لتسوية أو لسلام؟ هل مستعدين يقدموا تنازلات اليوم؟
Look, I don't believe the Israeli government is, no. I know Israelis who are, but I think they're in a minority, and that's the problem. You know, it's very easy. I go to Israel. It's very easy to go to Israel, go and see Israelis whom you know think the same way as you do, and say, oh, well, it'll be okay, but it's not. And let me just go back to what I was saying. Those Palestinians who at one stage were prepared to accept the partition of Palestine, that they'd never go back to Haifa, but they'd have a state, West Bank and Gaza. Many of those people I know well have now gone back to saying, it's worthless, we want all of Palestine. Now, you see, you can't keep holding out to people apparent gifts and hopes, and then taking it all away, and then holding it out again. You can't keep doing that. You know, Mahmoud Abbas effectively lost the elections. Not because the Palestinians wanted to live under an Islamic regime, but because they were sick of the corruption of the Palestinian Authority. And rightly so, in my view, and in the view of a lot of other people. Both Israelis and Palestinians say that. And I think that, you know, as long as you hold out false hopes to people, then they lie shattered. Then you hold them out some more false hopes. George Bush, there'll be a Palestinian state by the end of the year. And then when that gets shattered, which it will, what are we going to hold out next? That's what turns people to violence, the idea that you can no longer trust the person on the other side of the wall or the other side of the ocean. And I don't see how we're going to get out of that. What is left of the Palestinian cause, you asked just now? Tell me what the Palestinian cause is these days. It seems so hopeless. And I don't see, other than sort of some huge Western withdrawal from the Middle East region, which is, we're talking, you know, this is on an epic scale, I have no idea. I don't see what's going to happen.
بال2006 بالحرب الإسرائيلية على لبنان، يعني أنت كنت موجود وكنت عم تغطي هيدي الحرب. نحن بلبنان نتغنى أنه هذه الحرب لقنت الإسرائيليين درس. هل فعلا تعلموا الإسرائيليين وصار في اليوم بعد هذه الحرب تفهم أكثر لموضوع التسوية وموضوع السلام؟ عم بحكي على المجتمع الإسرائيلي.
Well, on the left in Israel, they knew that already. They knew that war does not work. People like Uri Avneri were writing this prominently in newspapers for a long time before, let alone during. The Israeli government and the Israeli military, they keep forgetting what happened before. So sometimes to the Hezbollah, by the way, but that's not what we're talking about. When you look to ordinary Israeli soldiers, and in Israel, obviously, I come across men who fought in Lebanon. They have some respect for the Hezbollah because they know they fight and fight hard and don't run away. Soldiers do respect soldiers on the other side. But the top military still believe that if you strike harder and strike harder and strike harder against the Palestinians, against Hezbollah, whatever, that they'll somehow feel crushed and broken and end. And that is not going to happen. Those days are gone when you can do that. When I go to Washington and I open the New York Times or the Washington Post, the Middle East, which I read about, is incomprehensible. It bears no relation to the place I live in.
لم أقل ذلك مطلقا أو أنوه بأي طريقة أن الأمريكيين حاولوا إنهاء حياته. كما ذكرت في إحدى المرات فإنني شخصيا وجدت جمعة معلقا من رقبته وهو ينزف من ذراعه. لقد شنق نفسه وشق ذراعه. لقد قال لي إنه مل هذه الأشياء لأن الحياة في غوانتنامو لم تعد تحتمل، وأنه قيل له إنه سيمكث هناك 50 عاما ولن يرى أو يتحدث مع أسرته مرة أخرى. لقد قال إن الحياة في مثل هذه الظروف لا تستحق العيش، رغم أنه من الصعب لدى البعض أن يصدقوا أن يصل جمعة إلى مثل هذه الحالة، فإن طبيعة وجوده هناك هي التي أوصلته إلى تلك الحالة.
في آخر رسائله كيف كانت مشاعره؟
عملية نزوح واسعة لأهالي أرغنداب تزامنت مع التحذيرات التي وجهت لهم من قبل قوات الناتو تدعوهم فيها للرحيل أو التزام منازلهم وسط أجواء توتر تهيمن على منطقة الجنوب بأسرها وتشعر المواطنين الأفغان بهشاشة الموقف الأمني.
الوضع سيء جدا هنا ونحن مضطرون للمغادرة لأننا أصبحنا عالقين بين طالبان من جهة والقوات الأخرى من جهة ثانية. ماذا نفعل؟ نحن فقراء ولا توجد لدينا مواصلات.
Like Jack Black's character, the teacher in this school of rock seems to be the one with the real passion. These techies may not make beautiful music together, but their teacher says the teamwork has been right on key. Lindsay Janis, CNN, London.
Has it finished? How to murder a song, a good song as well, knocking on heaven's door. I've never heard it like that before, and I don't want to hear it like that again.
إن حزب الله منظمة إرهابية، ولن تسر الإدارة الأمريكية عندما ترى الإرهاب غدا وقد اتخذ له مقاعد في الحكومة وسيطر على ثلثها المعطل. فيا حضرة رايس، قمت بزيارة ناجحة في الوعود خاسرة في التطبيق. قبولات السرايات التي بقيت سرا من قدس الأقداس لن تبدل في واقع الحال، والاجتماع الحاشد أكثريا سبق وأن صور الإعلام مثله من عنكر إلى قريطم.
Returned home after 5.5 years as a prisoner of war here in Vietnam, convinced the civilian leadership in the United States never committed enough troops to Vietnam and never had a clear strategy for victory. And the legacy of those memories has been evident throughout his political career. Early on in the House, for example, back in 1983, then freshman Congressman John McCain opposed a Republican president, Ronald Reagan, when Reagan sent a modest number of U.S. Marines into Lebanon. More recently, of course, those views have been evident in the debate over the Iraq War. Now, McCain supported the invasion and has consistently rejected democratic comparisons of the war in Iraq to the quagmire here in Vietnam.
إعجاب الوالد مراد بأوباما وإطلاقه على باكورة أبنائه لم يكن عابرا أو لدهشة بلا هدف، فقد سحره الرجل المفوه قبل عامين حين زار أوباما كينيا أرض أجداده، وسحنة أضحت مصدر فخر للوالد الإفريقي.
فكرة أن يعطى مولود الأول اسم أوباما لم تكن صدفة. أمريكي أفريقي أسود يصل أن يكون ولأول مرة مرشح الحزب الديمقراطي وله فرص كبيرة جدا أن يدخل البيت الأبيض ويغير التاريخ.
حميمية لا تنتهي بين زينب ومولودها، هي الأخرى كان الاسم يطوف بخيالها حتى قبل أن تتبين نوع الطفل.
ونحن بنتابع في التلفزيون قلت له أنا ولو ولد حسميه أوباما.
ولا لبناني، أنت لست مع بشير تخون ولا لبناني ولا لبناني بيسمح لك تخونه. لو سمحت لا شيعي لا سني لا مسيحي لا حزب الله لا كتائبي أبدا. استاذ جعان خليه يتابع. تلتزم بعدم الحوار او تصمت. لا صح، تصمت انت وحضرتك تصمت. هناك مذيعه تدير مقالاتك، انا هون عن العمليه. استاذ شجعان اذا بتريد هناك مذيعه تدير الحوار. لو سمحت استاذ شجعان لو سمحت اذا بتريد امثالك في مزبله التاريخ. استاذ مصطفى لو سمحت لا بدي وقف لو سمحت لو سمحت استاذ شجعان بدنا نتابع الحوار. نحن سالنا استاذ مصطفى لحظه لو سمحت استاذ مصطفى. انت ممن روج الاستقلال 17 عيار. لا بدي ولا يجب ان تتحدث عن المقاومه. خلينا بدي اوقف كلامه. بدي اوقف كلامه. تعلم التهذيب لمن تطلع بلبنان. انت تلفزيون حضاري. انت تتكلم على شاشه تلفزيون حضاري. انت معروف مقالات الصحف في مصر تكتب عنك يوميا وعن فضائحك الماليه وعلاقاتك بالمخابرات المصرية ونشرت أرقام الهواتف الهاتفية.
أنت يعني من الناس اللي تعرضوا لاعتداء بأفغانستان، ولكن دايما كنت تلاقي مبرر للي عم يعتدوا عليك.
No, I didn't find an excuse. What happened was that my car broke down in a village on the Afghan border, and my bad luck was that it broke down amid a group of Afghan men who had just lost their families in an American B-52 attack. In other words, the West had just destroyed their families, and Afghans love their families as much as we do. And I was the first Westerner they had seen, and their reaction was, hurt him or kill him. And what they did was wrong. Of course it was wrong. I always say there is no excuse for violence. But I said at the end of my article that such was our treatment of them, that had I been the Afghan, I would probably have attacked Robert Fisk as well. That was not an excuse for them. But I could understand the feelings of rage and fury when their families have been torn to pieces by us. And that's what happened. Many Muslims wrote letters to me afterwards saying how sorry they were about it. I hope they were, they should be, but, you know, there's nothing you can do about that. I mean, the Taliban, and these were not Taliban men, they came from Kandahar then, the Taliban are extremely savage and they're ruthless in the way they treat their enemies, including, of course, their Afghan enemies, chopping off their heads, mutilating their bodies. I mean, this is not a civilized world. But you see, we are, I said earlier on, you know, we are, when Westerners are shooting Muslims in Muslim countries, they must leave. It's over. There is nothing more to be offered. We can offer them the democracy of Karzai, which is a highly corrupt government, or we can offer the Iraqis democracy. But when we're killing Muslims, it's over.
ماذا لو انسحب الأمريكيون الآن؟ شو بيصير بأفغانستان وبالعراق؟
Well, at some point, the Iraqis will have to talk to each other. They may come up with a different sort of government. They will have to include the insurgents, not Al-Qaeda. The Iraqis will have to deal with Al-Qaeda. The Americans can't do that. But they will have somehow to bring the insurgents in. The Americans are already talking to the insurgents. They're paying some of them to fight the other insurgents, after all. And I think that, you know, at the end of the day, everyone will have to talk to all the various insurgent groups, including the Taliban. You know, the West has a track record of saying, we will not talk to the North Vietnamese, we will not talk to the Viet Cong, we will not talk to the North Koreans, or the IRA, or Mau Mau in Kenya, or Irgun in Palestine, and so on and so forth. And we all will talk to them in the end, every one of them. The IRA is now in the government of Northern Ireland, for heaven's sakes. And we say we will not talk to the insurgents, we won't talk to Muqtada Sadr, we won't talk to the Taliban. We will, believe me, we will, and we'll have to, because there's no other way.
روبرت، أنت التقيت ببن لادن 3 مرات. هل كنت بتتوقع إنه يصير هو رمز للإرهاب؟
He was already becoming a symbol. I'm not quite sure of what. He was certainly becoming a symbol when I last saw him, but that was before 9/11. He wanted to see me after 9/11, but I couldn't reach him. The Taliban were trying to take me to him, and there was an American air raid on the village in front. And I was saying, look, try to get through. And they were saying, no, no, no. They didn't want to die, nor did I, for that matter. So I didn't see him. Look, he was a very he was a very ruthless man. I mean, he was polite to me, but I could tell he was a very ruthless man. He was a Wahhabi. And he thought a lot. He had a self-confidence that was quite frightening. You know, he's one of the few Arab figures I've interviewed who doesn't speak and give a reply immediately to your question. You know, like most people, Arabs who ask questions, they want to say something quickly in case they look stupid. You know, we're the same. But he would sit for a minute after I'd asked a question and clean his teeth with a piece of mishwak wood, just thinking about it, and then come out with a perfect reply with no ers or ums in it at all. So this was a man who was very certain of his views. You couldn't ask for compromise. You couldn't debate anything with bin Laden because he knew he was right, and that's a very dangerous man to come across. He would be polite. He'd be courteous. I've sat on the ground and eaten supper with him, surrounded by his Al-Qaeda people with weapons. But it was his absolute certainty in his own views that was frightening. There was no way, and you know, he's had some very strange ideas. He thought there was going to be a civil war in America between Texas and New York. And I said, you know, I don't think your foreign understanding is quite up to scratch, you know. But the other thing I think about bin Laden is that I think he's irrelevant now. I don't think he matters anymore. I mean, I'm sure the Americans would like to capture him, and they don't seem to be able to. But, you know, I think it's a bit like the discovery of the atom bomb. Once the atom bomb was made, you could go around the world and arrest all the nuclear scientists, but it wouldn't do any good because the bomb had been born. And the same applies to bin Laden. You see, he would regard, I don't, but he would regard that his achievement is the creation of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda exists. It doesn't need bin Laden. It's born. If you kill bin Laden, Al-Qaeda will continue to exist. And instead of constantly bombing and bombarding and rocketing Muslim world, what we ought to be trying to do is look at the issue of injustice in the Middle East. If we could deal with injustice and deal with it fairly, I think Al-Qaeda's purpose would cease to exist. But we don't do that. We want to fight them. And that's what they want. And that's the danger.
روبرت، في بلد بغيب كثير عن مقالاتك ورغم يمكن أهميته بالمنطقة اللي هو سوريا، وين رايحة سوريا؟
Oh, I wrote a big piece about 5 weeks ago about the imprisonment of the human rights campaigners in Syria. And I wrote another bigger piece about the Syrian Muhabarat last year. And indeed, after the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri, I was very harsh on the Syrians, and I named leading officials who I thought were involved in the murder, not Syrian but Lebanese. Look, Syria's policy has always been wait, sit it out, wait it through, don't commit, wait. Thus, for example, we were told Syria wanted back the Golan and started negotiating with the Israelis over it. Then the whole thing was torn up, and the Syrians were told, no, you'll have to start again. Now it turns out the Israelis are talking to the Syrians about Golan through the Turks. And this has been acknowledged by the Israelis and by Bashar al-Assad. Where is Syria going? Syria waits. It's its policy. It knows, for example, when the Americans reached Baghdad in 2003, we who saw them arrive didn't know if the tanks would turn right to Tehran or left to Damascus. So the Syrians just waited and did nothing. And now, with the Americans under such terrible pressure for them in Iraq and trying to find a way out, they need the Syrians, as the Syrians rightly judged they would in the end. They waited and waited. I think the Iraqi insurgency may have saved Syria from regime change. I mean, I go to Damascus, and I find that now it is much less harsh or authoritarian as it was under Hafez al-Assad, much less. But it's nothing like a democracy, and don't even imagine it. Where's it going to go? I think it'll try to just go on the way it is. You know, one of the things that Hafez al-Assad did is he kept people in their jobs forever. You know, I mean, it's only recently that we sort of realized that Mustafa Klaus is no longer the defense minister. But prior to that, every time I went to Damascus, I always saw the same people in the same jobs. This was the system of Ba'ath Party loyalty. And, you know, the strange thing about Syria is that, you know, when Saddam was in power, if you arrived from London or from Paris or from Beirut and you arrived in Damascus, you felt that this is an ominous, despotic regime. But when you arrived from Saddam's Baghdad, it felt like a liberal democracy. It's all a matter of comparison, you know. Where is Syria going? I don't know is the answer to that. You know, there are clearly more links between Lebanese people and Syrian people than we write or talk about. I'm not talking about the leadership, I'm talking about families. In Tripoli, for example, so many Lebanese families have relatives living in Homs and Hama. And of course, 100 years ago, there was no boundary between the two, between Lebanon and Syria. That was created by the French. But let me just finish a second. Look, I think that up to a point, the chaos in Iraq now, the anarchy in Iraq, has frightened so many Syrians that they, with all their criticism within their homes of the regime and the lack of freedoms, they would rather live as the way they are now than endure what the Iraqi people are going through now. And I think, again, we have to thank Mr. Bush's invasion for that.
روبرت، هل بتوافق بعض المراقبين اللي بيقولوا انه سوريا اليوم والنظام السوري اليوم هو حاجة إسرائيلية أمريكية؟
Well, the Americans need them in order to get out of Iraq, like they need the Iranians in the end. And they will talk to the Iranians. I mean, whether they bomb them or not, they will talk to the Iranians. And my understanding is they do already talk to the Syrians through third parties sometimes, and sometimes occasionally directly. You know, not about Golan, but about the situation in the Middle East and particularly Iraq. And, you know, Syria, as we know, has a long border with Iraq. They can open the door to let someone through into Iraq as an insurgent, or they can keep the door closed. Again, they could just wait. Look, Syria is it's a historic country, a historical country. It will stay. It's not going to disappear. I don't know about other countries in the region, but Syria is going to stay in some form or another. I don't know if Baathism as a socialist system can go on forever. It was certainly intended to. That's why there was a Ba'ath Party in Iraq, although, of course, it then suffered the usual socialist problem, the split, as we know. What comes after the Ba'ath? Not surely the anarchy of Iraq. What's happened in a lot of societies, you see, is that these old rigid systems have metamorphosed into something else. In Eastern Europe now, there are certainly parties which were the Communist Party, but they've renamed themselves the Social Democrats or something else, and they're still there, they're the same faces, but they've realized that time has moved on.
No.
Does the Syrian regime realize that time moves on? the Syrian regime waits, as it always has, patiently. Now, we, the West, need Syrian help. What is going to be the price of that help?
عودة لمتابعة برنامج ترانزيت مع روبرت فيسك. روبرت، يعني حكيت عن المحادثات السورية التركية اللي تركيا هي الوسيط من أجل المحادثات السورية الإسرائيلية. هل برأيك أنه الأمريكيين تضايقوا من هذه المحادثات، خاصة أنه شفنا نقلا عن مصادر إسرائيلية عديدة بتقول أنه الكلام عن المفاعل النووي السوري جاء لحتى يغطي على موضوع المحادثات السورية الإسرائيلية؟
Look, Israel, when it concerns Israel, will do what it wants to do. It's not going to be worried what Washington thinks if it starts talks via Turkey with Syria. I mean, during the 1982 invasion, after there was a ceasefire on the line, Israelis and Syrian Muhabarat used to meet near Ain Zalta. Their cars would come up and they'd talk in order to prevent more fighting. They didn't want to have accidental shell fire. This usually happens in wars. There's nothing surprising about it. But, you know, Israel is much more concerned about Washington's policies than it is about the effect of its own policies on Washington, which is part of the damage that's done in the relationship between the two countries. But Israel ultimately will do what it wants in its own interest. It supported the war in Iraq. It provided, remember, some of the totally bogus material, information about the so-called weapons of mass destruction, which didn't exist. Israeli politicians were calling for the war. Now they're silent about it. It's not their problem. They're not involved, you see. So, I mean, I think that Americans have either forgotten or not understood that Israel played a prominent role in beating the drums for war. Now, none of this is to be nice about Saddam, who was a very cruel dictator. We know that. But it does say that, you know, nothing that happens in the Middle East happens by chance. And the story, the narrative that is laid down for us, Israel fighting alone against the brutal Arabs, or the Arabs cringing in resistance and refusing, they all talk to each other. You know, I mean, I'll tell you a funny story. Israel says, we will never talk to Hamas. Well, they always had talks with Hamas. When they wanted to attack the PLO in Beirut, they built up Hamas and gave them privileges to build new mosques in Gaza as a counterbalance to PLO terror, you see. And I remember when the Hamas and Islamic Jihad prisoners were sent into Majd al-Zuhur in southern Lebanon, Lubnan Junubi. And I was down there one day and chatting to them and interviewing them as usual. You know, we did this once every 2 or 3 weeks. And I said to them I was going to Israel the next day via, I think I was going via Cyprus, actually. And one of them went over to his tent and came bounding back with a notebook. He said, would you like Shimon Peres's home number? And I said, yes. He wrote it down. And it was his home number. And Peres had obviously been involved in talking to these people, but telling us, of course, we will never talk to terror, etc., etc., etc. So, you know, you've got to realize that everybody talks to each other. This is the Middle East. The Americans may believe all this nonsense about the situation here, but I think, you see, one of the big mistakes we make about the Middle East region, Arabs especially, we think they're not as bright as us, and they are. They're very intelligent. They're just as intelligent as us. They know what's going on very well. They understand. You know, my landlord, Abed, my driver, all the people I talk to in Beirut every day, people I have lunch with, they have a much smarter idea, a much clearer idea of what's happening in this region. They're all the specialists at the Brookings Institution, the State Department, the Pentagon, the CIA. I mean, when you listen to the stuff coming out of Washington, it's quite remarkable. When I go to Washington and I open the New York Times or the Washington Post, the Middle East, which I read about, is incomprehensible. It bears no relation to the place I live in. And it's like somewhere over the Atlantic, there's a glass wall that you smash through into a never-never land. And of course, when you come back here, what you read about Washington is all wrong too.
روبرت، بتقول إنه كل العالم عم تحكي مع بعضها. يعني مع الإسرائيليين، يعني كان حماس والإسرائيليين أم السوريين والإسرائيليين. حزب الله هو الوحيد اللي ما عنده علاقة مع إسرائيل، صحيح؟
Well, they can communicate through the International Red Cross, for example, which they do, over prisoner exchanges, bodies, etc. Hezbollah talks to Hamas, and Hamas talks to the Israelis. If there's a message to be got out, of course, all the Israelis have to do is watch Al-Manar television. And if the Hezbollah want to know what the Israelis are thinking, they have people who speak fluent Hebrew, they can watch Israeli television. I mean, it's not as if there's a... There is a wall, of course. It's not as if there's complete silence and you can't understand what's going on. Hezbollah had a spokesman who was talking very, I thought, very intelligently and thoughtfully in an interview in An-Nahar, I think it was the 21st of April, about what was happening inside the Israeli military. And I think he's got it right. The Israelis had an analyst in Jerusalem who was not so good on the Hezbollah, but had a pretty good idea what's going on in southern Lebanon, north of the Litani. So I think they know how to listen to each other, and they know how to get messages across. No, of course, they're not going to sit down in direct talks. This is ridiculous. But messages go backwards and forwards, and they will always do that.
بدي أرجع للبنان. سؤال على موضوع المحكمة الدولية للرئيس رفيق الحريري. هل تعتقد أنه ممكن هذه المحكمة أن تتحول إلى مادة لتسوية ما سياسية؟
Look, I said at the beginning that I wasn't sure this tribunal would ever come about. Now, we've got the beginnings of a tribunal with the appointment of a civil servant, a Briton from the United Nations, who will come first, I believe, to Lebanon, then will stay in New York, and will also then go to The Hague. But you see, the problem is that when the tribunal was first mooted, when the investigation began, first with the Irish police officer's report, then by the successive judges who've come here, a tribunal that's taking an awful long time to set up, an inquiry that seems to be going on forever. I've never known, you know, a 3-year inquiry into a murder of this scale that hasn't come anywhere, apart from a few interesting details, which are there in the reports.
ولكن بليبيريا تشارلز تايلر كمان أخذت 3 سنين.
Yeah. Yes, but the point I'm making is that, you see, when it began, America didn't need Syria. The West didn't need Syria. We were just, you know, we were into Iraq. We were in trouble in Iraq, but we weren't that badly in trouble. Now, we the West, need Syrian help. What is going to be the price of that help? Why haven't we seen the tribunal actually being set up now? Why aren't we moving forward? There's another question, of course, is what's happened with our favourite missing witness who suddenly disappeared. And now we see demonstrations, which of course are authorised in Damascus by his family. Where is he? And so this raises another issue. I mean, was he a real witness? Was he telling the truth? Has he really disappeared? And the longer it takes to establish the tribunal, the more things like this are going to happen to muddy the waters, cloud the issues. People will start dying of old age before they go to the tribunal at this rate. It's not moving forward very fast, is it? And I don't, you know, I know that the Prime Minister trusts the United States in the sense that it wants continued support from the West. Although being called the American-supported Prime Minister is not something I'd want labelled onto me if I was a Prime Minister. Thank God I never will be. But, you know, I think that America has shifting alliances, and it will also put its own interests first. And I think that in due course we're going to see America closer to Syria and much less enthusiastic about the tribunal. That's not what they say. It's not what Bush says. It's not what the State Department says. But that may be one change that will come with the next president. There won't be the same impetus to pursue the murderers of Rafik Hariri. And that, of course, is a danger for Lebanon because it further, again, it gets rid of the hopes that were placed in the West. Just as the Palestinian hopes have been smashed, you would find on a smaller scale, Lebanese hopes would be smashed. And here again, here comes the West promising this and doing something else. That's the danger of the tribunal.
روبرت، سؤال أخير. هل شي مرة كتبت مقال وندمت عليه كتير وعملت فيه خطأ كبير؟
I can tell you one straight away. In 1976, I did an article about the hashish trade in Lebanon, about hashish production in the Bekaa Valley. And I mixed up in my statistics, I mixed up the product from the crop. In other words, I made the hashish export infinitely larger than it actually was. And the Ministry of Information, which was not the same staff as there now, rang me up during the Civil War and called me in and said, Robert, do you realise if your statistics were correct, it would need one supertanker leaving Tripoli every day to carry the hashish out, and if your statistics were correct, every man, woman and child in the Bekaa Valley would each year earn the gross national product of Lebanon since 1933. Now, you'll enjoy translating that into Arabic. That was a story, I must admit, I thought I got wrong. But if you're talking politically, I think one of my great regrets is that most of my predictions have been dark ones, and most of them have been accurate.
شكرا روبرت فيسك على وجودك معنا. تذكروا لما تطفوا الشاشة الأحداث ما بتوقف. ترانزيت الأسبوع المقبل نفس الشاشة ونفس الوقت.